Ladies and gentlemen, what if I told you the world is shifting beneath our feet? India's decision to move away from the US dollar in international trade marks more than just an economic change. It reflects a deep and deliberate shift in global power dynamics. For decades, the US dollar has dominated the world's financial system. Countries around the globe have relied on it for trade, energy transactions, and the storage of reserves. This reliance has given the United States unparalleled influence over global finance and geopolitics. When a nation like India, one of the world's fastest growing major economies, begins to step away from the dollar, it sends a signal that the old order is being questioned and a new one is being quietly but confidently constructed. This shift is symbolic of a world that is no longer unipolar. After the Cold War, the United States emerged as the singular global superpower, and the dollar became the linchpin of international trade. But over the years, many countries, including India, have witnessed how dollar dependency can translate into vulnerability. The use of sanctions, trade restrictions, and financial blockades by the US government has raised alarm bells among nations that value their sovereignty. For India, reducing reliance on the dollar is a strategic move to safeguard its autonomy in decision-making and to shield itself from external financial pressures that could be exerted through dollar dominance. Furthermore, fantastic. This move places India in alignment with a growing number of countries that are exploring or adopting alternative currencies for trade. China and Russia, for instance, have already made significant strides in trading with each other using their own currencies, bypassing the dollar. By joining this trend, India is not just diversifying its currency use, but positioning itself as a leader in a multipolar economic world where no single currency or country holds unchecked control. It also reflects India's desire to have a financial system that better represents emerging economies and their interests rather than being overly influenced by institutions and systems rooted in Western dominance. This development also ties into broader efforts to create regional financial ecosystems that are more self-sufficient and less exposed to external economic shocks. By trading in local or alternative currencies, India and its partners can minimize the impact of dollar fluctuations, rising US interest rates, or economic decisions made in Washington that not align with their interests. It is a proactive step toward financial resilience and long-term economic independence. Moreover, this shift is not happening in isolation. It is backed by political intent, institutional support, and strategic partnerships. India has been deepening its ties with countries like Russia, Iran, and even some in Southeast Asia and Africa, negotiating deals that bypass the dollar. These partnerships are not just transactional. They are based on mutual respect, shared goals, and a collective desire to reshape the world economic order in a way that is more just and balanced. When a nation of India's scale and influence makes such a move, it inspires other nations to consider doing the same. In this sense, India's action is not just symbolic, but catalytic, acting as a trigger for wider transformation in how global power is distributed and exercised. India's growing alliance with Russia and China is not merely about convenience or temporary cooperation. It reflects a deeper assertion of strategic sovereignty in an increasingly polarized and complex global environment. India's ability to maintain relationship with both the East and the West demonstrates that it refuses to be confined by the expectations or pressures of any single global bloc. By strengthening its ties with Russia and China, two of the world's most influential non-Western powers, India is taking control of its foreign policy narrative, choosing autonomy over alignment and strategy over submission. Historically, India has maintained a policy of non-alignment, particularly during the Cold War era, when it avoided becoming a pawn in the ideological battle between the US and the Soviet Union. Today, that spirit continues, but in a far more calculated and nuanced form. India is now a global player with a fast-growing economy, advanced technological capabilities, and significant geopolitical weight. Its outreach to Russia and China is not about ideological affinity. It is about ensuring that its national interests are served without being tethered to Western approval or restricted by a single geopolitical path. Russia remains one of India's most trusted defense partners. The relationship spans decades and includes cooperation on nuclear energy, space, and military technology. At a time when Western nations are imposing sanctions on Russia and pushing others to follow suit, India has instead chosen to prioritize its own energy security and strategic autonomy. It continues to import Russian oil and expand defense cooperation, not as an act of rebellion, but as a declaration that its decisions will be guided by national interest, not by peer pressure. With China, the relationship is more complex. The two nations have had historical tensions, including border disputes and competitive regional ambitions. Yet, despite these challenges, India engages with China on multiple platforms such as BRICS, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, SCO, and multilateral trade discussions. This demonstrates India's maturity in diplomacy, recognizing that cooperation in some areas can coexist with competition in others. India's willingness to work with China where mutual benefit is possible shows that it is not beholden to simplistic friend or foe narratives. The triangular dynamic between India, Russia, and China reflects a shifting global order where power is no longer centralized. In this landscape, India's strategy is to act as an independent pole, collaborating where beneficial, resisting where necessary, and always keeping its national priorities at the forefront. The phrase, "this is a global South reawakening," captures a deeper transformation that is taking place among developing nations, particularly in Asia, Africa, and Latin America. For decades, these regions have been treated as peripheries in the global order, resources to be extracted, markets to be exploited, and voices to be sidelined. But today, countries like India are beginning to rise not just economically, but politically and philosophically, challenging the outdated systems of global governance and rewriting the rules of engagement. This reawakening is not about revenge or rebellion. It is about recognition of power, identity, and rightful place in the world. India's decision to walk away from dollar dependency is one of the strongest signs that the global South is no longer content with playing a supporting role. It is not just about currency, it is about credibility. It sends a message that developing nations are capable of making bold, sovereign decisions that align with their own national interests rather than waiting for permission from international powers. This spirit is spreading rapidly. Countries in Africa are forming regional trading blocs. Latin American nations are discussing new financial institutions, and Southeast Asia is building digital and trade infrastructures that are independent of Western oversight. What makes this moment historic is that the global South is no longer waiting for reform from above. It is building new structures from below. Platforms like BRICS, the African Continental Free Trade Area, and ASEAN are examples of how the global South is creating its own alliances, financial systems, and diplomatic forums. These initiatives are more than political gestures. They are signs of a maturing consciousness that refuses to be defined by colonial legacies, debt traps, or foreign agendas. India plays a central role in this reawakening, not just because of its size or economy, but because of its history and moral authority. Having experienced colonization, exploitation, and marginalization, India understands the psychological weight that comes with centuries of exclusion. But rather than allowing that history to become a burden, India is turning it into fuel for innovation, for policy reform, and for leadership in the global South. It is using its voice to speak not just for itself, but for others who have been voiceless in global forums for far too long. This reawakening also involves redefining success and power. The global South is beginning to value indigenous knowledge, sustainable development, cultural pride, and social cohesion as much as GDP or military strength. It is no longer seeking to mimic the West, but to offer an alternative vision, one that is rooted in balanced community and fairness. India's moves on the global stage reflect this broader awakening by shifting alliances, rejecting outdated economic models, and amplifying the concerns of fellow developing nations. India is helping to build a world where respect is not dictated by military budgets or reserve currencies, but by the depth of vision and the strength of values. This is not a moment. It is a movement. The global South is no longer asleep. It is wide awake, alert, and ready to lead. The change India is embracing, moving away from dollar dependency and aligning more closely with powers like Russia and China, is not merely a reaction to global politics or economic trends. It is deeply rooted in a growing sense of identity and self-respect. For too long, developing nations like India were expected to conform to a global system designed by others for others. They were advised, instructed, and often coerced into policies that served the interests of more powerful nations. But that era is fading, and in its place is emerging a confident, self-aware India that is making decisions based not on fear or tradition, but on who it is and what it stands for. India's identity is grounded in thousands of years of civilization, cultural wisdom, intellectual achievement, and spiritual resilience. This identity is not fragile or borrowed. It is powerful, independent, and rooted in values that transcend temporary global alliances. As India rises economically and diplomatically, it no longer sees itself as a junior partner in someone else's system. Instead, it is beginning to define its role based on its own sense of self, not based on how it is perceived by the West. This is why India's shift away from the dollar is so significant. It is not just an economic strategy. It is a statement of who India is and what it refuses to be. Self-respect plays a central role in this transformation. Over the years, India has witnessed how dependency on Western institutions and currencies can translate into limited sovereignty. From being pressured on foreign policy decisions to facing criticism on domestic matters by Western think tanks and governments, India has come to recognize that true independence requires more than just political freedom. It requires financial autonomy and ideological clarity. The decision to seek alternatives to the